Hey, this is Chad. 3, 2, 1. Hi, this is Chadillac with the Cage Rage podcast, and you're here for another edition of Cage Rage History for MMA, where we're bringing you what happened a long time ago in MMA, and I'm laughing because we're having a good time today, as should be the case every day. And if you were back there with us in those old days of MMA, you'd know why we're laughing, because the stories, unfettered as they may be, are the best times of our lives and will never happen again. We've been talking about some of them, and they were a great time. And if you weren't there, you wouldn't understand, and you wouldn't know. And if you say you remember them, you probably weren't there anyway. So we're talking today about UFC 13. It was May 30th, 1997 in Augusta, Georgia. This was the debut of a unknown punk from California, the Huntington Beach bad boy, Tito Ortiz. He fought for free. We also had a card that had a Captain America on it, who had no name at that time. His name was Randy Couture, went on to greatness. And the main fight of the night was a kid named Vitor, the Phenom Belfort, and he fought Tank Abbott. I'm going to let Miguel, the archivist, Iterati, take it away and fill in everything I've already screwed up. Miguel, what's going on?
Hey, how's it going, man? A lot of fun looking back at UFC 13. I'm trying to get my memory together from being live at the event. So if you look at it, it does look like everything is set up for tournaments here. What you have basically is 2 4-man tournaments. And you had Mezger and Christoph Leninger. Leninger had appeared in an earlier UFC. That turned into a slug, a hard fight for Mezger. Mezger went into the fight with Ortiz in the second round. The tournament was actually Enson Inoue and Royce Alger. Inoue unlocked Alger but could not continue. He got his eye orbital broken. And Ortiz and Albritton had been the alternate fight, and Ortiz stepped in as the alternate to take on Mezger, and Mezger won by a controversial choke in that one. So that's the seed for the whole Tito Ortiz and Ken Shamrock and Lions Den rivalry. It comes from that. Ortiz never thought Mezger beat him on that day.
Take the audience through what happened on that, why that's controversial, Miguel.
Well, Tito comes out, and Wes Albritton, with all due respect to Wes, because he did something, especially by UFC 13, you're still talking about rare individuals that are getting into the cage, right? So, with all due respect to him, he was outmatched, and Tito was just much bigger, much stronger, much faster, got a takedown, sat on him, and just punched him out, and it didn't take much more than 30 seconds, right? With that, you had Christoph Leninger in the fight with Mezger, and Mezger's not supposed to fight. And, if you remember Leninger fought back at UFC 3, he fought Ken Shamrock, so there was a logical reason to put him in with Mezger, right? So Mezger fights him, and I remember Leninger before and after this fight, and Leninger's a tough guy. This guy was a judo guy, fought in a gi, which you can't do anymore and stuff, definitely was a throwback type of dude, and so he had the experience of fighting Shamrock. He extended Mezger the full 15 minutes, so that's a tough fight. And Inoue doesn't continue, so you get Ortiz off of a 30-second tune-up in here. He was fresh and ready to go, Ortiz and Mezger, is a pretty physical, even matchup. Tito was doing okay, and Mezger got him, in the sort of a guillotine position. I don't know if it was a tap. You could ask Tito, he'd say no. You could ask Guy, he'd say yes. Maybe the ref stepped in, but the fight ended in a guillotine, and Ortiz was mad the second the fight ended. He was upset with it. It's not like he had to think about it. He wasn't happy with the way it ended from the beginning, and that led to some antics after the show too. But yeah, that's basically what went on. And Mezger always treated it as like, Mezger was the pro at that point. He had experience and fought all over the world. So Mezger at that point was like, yeah, I won, and that's it. We move on. And Ortiz was like, wait a minute, I didn't. So that's the seed of that rivalry.
Yeah, and Tito later avenged that, and then he doubly avenged it by coming back and smashing Ken to a pulp, not once but twice, and did UFC record sales, launched the UFC into their first ESPN visit, which by today's standards, you look at the UFC joining ESPN Plus and all of that, and it seems like such a big deal. But Tito Ortiz is actually the reason, along with Ken Shamrock, that the UFC is with ESPN today, because that was the real introduction, for whatever that's worth. So this was a much bigger deal and a much bigger fight than maybe people recognize today. So anyways, that happened. Tito fought for free that night, correct? He technically didn't get any money. I think he probably did, but it was probably in an envelope afterwards. But he was a collegiate wrestler at that time, so he couldn't get paid. Am I remembering that correctly, Miguel?
Yep, that's right. He was attending UCal Santa Barbara and was on a wrestling scholarship, supposedly. So he didn't take a payday. In the post-fight party, they rented a room in the hotel, and Art Davie was still the matchmaker. Art Davie basically lined up all the fighters and thanked them and gave them an envelope. And yeah, Ortiz's envelope he didn't get an envelope. So that's kind of the lore behind that and the way they used to do things.
Yeah. So we move on through the ranks. Then we get to this guy named Randy Couture. Take that one away. Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, Couture came in with an Olympic, with the wrestling background, right? The Greco-Roman wrestling background. And that made him a guy to watch. So you kind of knew him coming in, as a guy to watch. Not that if you didn't watch collegiate wrestling, you still knew his background, and maybe he was the favorite heading into that tournament. He fought Tony Halme in the first round, and, rest in peace, Tony Halme. He passed away. He's from Finland, a country that, loves their fighting, Vikings and that sort of stuff. And, but he was a little bit of a character. He was like 300 pounds. He'd done WWE, so people knew him from his WWE time. He approached the UFC based on his boxing background from Finland. But, Couture got him to the floor immediately, didn't mess around with him, showed an efficient style, and Halme was in and out, But, again, you look back at it, when they announced that Tony Halme was doing the UFC, it was one of those things where it was like, hey, isn't that, I think his nickname was the Viking in UFC, or in the WWE, if I'm not mistaken, or at least something like that. So
I think he carried it over, didn't he?
Yeah, I maybe he's not the Viking. Maybe it's a different guy. But Halme definitely had a stint in the WWE, and but he was a tough guy, and a big dude. And like I said, he's passed away since. So maybe with the gimmicks and stuff, his early run at being Brock Lesnar didn't work out that well.
Yeah,
so,
he finished 0-4 as an MMA competitor, so it didn't work out so well for him. But
he was one of the guys, with a name heading in there. So the UFC by UFC 13 was scouring the world looking for talent, right? So you had Tony Halme and Couture, and then if I'm not mistaken, Steve Graham was like a North Carolina University football player or something like that. I don't know if he had a cup of coffee in the NFL, but he was a big dude, and he got taken out pretty early in his fight with Couture. Again, Couture's wrestling was going to trump everybody at that point.
Yeah,
and that's basically what happened there. So basically, you had the tournament. You had Mezger emerge as the winner. You had Couture emerge as the winner. You're starting to see these are weight class tournaments too. So you're starting to come out of the era with no weight classes, and they're starting to introduce here at least under 200, over 200, or whatever it was.
Yeah, it was a lightweight, heavyweight kind of thing at this point.
And then we got Tech and Vitor in the main event, And if I'm not mistaken, this was Vitor's debut with the UFC as well, right?
I don't think this was his debut. I think this was his second fight, wasn't it? Didn't he fight?
He fought Ferozzo and Teligman.
Yeah.
In UFC 12.
Yeah.
So he already had his coming out party. He had smoked Teligman, who was a pretty good boxer, and they beat up Ferozzo, who was a big dude.
Yeah.
And now he gets Tank. Tank came into this fight, with Al Stanky in his corner. Look at the box. Maybe one of the sharper versions of Tank, but he still wasn't going to be in the neighborhood. He got taken out pretty fast by a young and athletic Belfort. And, the rest is history, right?
Yeah, I mean, Belfort came out in that and just absolutely devastated Tank. But he'd done that with everybody. Belfort came out, and Ferozzo, I mean, he just made him look ridiculous. With Teligman, for anybody who doesn't remember Trey Teligman, he had a muscle missing in his pectoral. He was absolutely legendarily built in every way, except he had that muscle missing in his pec, and so he looked a little bit different. And Vitor beat him up pretty badly as well. And so Vitor became the Phenom very quickly. He went on to beat up Vanderlei Silva and knocked him out in 20 seconds or whatever it was. And Vitor, remember, was a boy. I mean, you're talking about a guy that had, 4 fights before he was 20 years old in the UFC and was just absolutely jacked. I mean, when you looked at this guy, he was a physical specimen. And he would cry in the back room, and they would have to slap him and force him to go out. So what you didn't see backstage was all the antics that the Gracies went through to get him out. And of course, Vitor wasn't a Gracie. And the Gracies sort of kind of had to encourage him to be kind of Gracie strong, if you will. And he departed very quickly from the Gracie camp. And, I don't know all the backstory behind that, but I kind of think the more interesting part of UFC 13 is the aftermath, not the. I mean, obviously the history of the fights tell themselves, and they are what they are. But you were there for the aftermath, Miguel. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we touched upon it before. The after fight party turned into a fight with Tank Abbott. Mark Coleman was there as a guest. He had just won the heavyweight tournament, and it became Abbott looking at a fight with Belfort.
And Abbott came in hammered, right?
He didn't grab his check at the after fight party. There were a couple of times where UFC people were trying to get Tank to leave, and he left, and he came back. And when he came back was when the shenanigans started, because it was after the money he'd been given out and art was gone and stuff like that. They were starting to wind down. He came back and got into it with Belfort's camp. Belfort at that point was still with Carlson Gracie, and that meant that Carlos Barreto was there and Walid Ismail was there. So with Ismail, you got the loose cannon, and Barreto, you got the giant guy there. So you had a little formidable superhero team over there. And Abbott, drunk, was picking a fight. He had his guys there. Tito noticeably absent, but Herrera and Ruiz doing dirty work. It was them that punches, chairs were thrown. And, at the end of the day, my impression from being there was that Tank sort of expected Mark Coleman to be on the side, kind of like America versus Brazil. Or, as with Tank, might be, whites versus non-whites,
Yeah.
I don't know what the attitude was, but I think he looked to Coleman, to go shoulder to shoulder with him when things got ugly there. And Coleman was also not averse to drinking. And,
that might be the understatement of a lifetime.
so Coleman had a few. And Coleman was, at that point, it's pretty fair to say Coleman was the toughest man on the planet.
There's no doubt about that.
He didn't side with anybody. He didn't want to side with Tank. He didn't want to side with anybody. He grabbed and threw a couple of chairs and waited out in the middle of them and just basically said, "Come on." Come on. And that was Mark. And in that case, at the end of the day, it was, again, another person, rest in peace, and this with hobgobs of respect, is Carlson Gracie Sr. And it was Gracie Sr. who calmed down Belfort, who was kind of getting ready to go. And Belfort was the guy you want in a street fight, you know what I mean? But like you said, sometimes he was a little gun shy, maybe hadn't harnessed his talent or whatever. But if you get him ready for that fight, Belfort was going to be the dangerous one, right?
Oh.
But he calmed Belfort down, and Ishmael was the instigator. He calmed Ishmael down and said, "Hey, Coleman's the champ. Let's just respect the champ. And the fight's not with him. Tank was the guy, And it all de-escalated. And the UFC got out of there with, nothing more than a little black eye and a short story, There were incidents in Denver involving Tank Abbott beating up, Pat Smith in an elevator and things like that. So the early UFCs were rough. Behind the scenes stuff was a lot of management and a lot of, personalities, Tank being one of them.
Yeah, let's go into that for just a second. I know that's a little bit off topic since that's not 13. But, Pat Smith was no joke. And is that true that Tank actually beat Pat Smith up in an elevator?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's. I was not at that UFC, so I don't know. I'm not an eyewitness person to it, but yeah, I believe that there were incidents in Denver in the early UFCs with Tank and Pat Smith.
And we're not saying Maurice Smith, by the way, because I don't believe that would have happened at all. I think that would have been exactly the opposite. But
yeah, Mo knew how to handle Tank, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Pat was a different ballgame. Pat was, I think, cut from the same cloth.
Yeah.
A guy who's if the decision has been made to settle things with your fists, I think Tank and Pat Smith were both guys that would be okay with that, right?
Yeah, let's just do that.
So yeah, I don't know details. I do know that there's stories. Nick Diaz got beat up in an elevator somewhere. Nick Diaz, some shit happened. It definitely was a bad town for the UFC. But yeah, sticking to UFC 13, like I said, there were a couple. I remember the couple of cops that got assigned to watch that hotel, and yeah, they're glad that got de-escalated because those literally, if Coleman, Belfort, Abbott are starting to go in a your basic hotel. Paneled walls moved in with seating and stuff. Your basic hotel convention room. Not a major convention room, just a basic hotel convention, like a wedding. You can put wedding tables there. You got those guys starting to go there. Those cops really had no option but to shoot people. I mean, that's the only way they were going to be able to stop that.
Yeah, and you're talking about
you go over there. Now you wait a minute. Now it was a situation where those cops were like, holy fuck, and they were scared.
Yeah, you're talking about the 90s, too. They didn't have the stun gun technology they have today and all of that. They had bullets. And can you imagine what would have happened if that would have been the end of the UFC. It would have all been over with, and we wouldn't be here today talking about this. This would have been something where we'd say, back in 1990s, there was this thing called the UFC, and it was NHB.
Well,
it was no holds
it's
barred fighting.
2017 now, so it would probably go something like, hey, Tank Abbott's 20 years in jail or done for assaulting a cop,
Yeah, today Tank Abbott was released. Former cockfighter Tank Abbott was released from jail today. Blah blah blah. He put on an extra 5 years for assaulting blah 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 guards, and who knows? Wow, Tank has led a bizarre life. He just got a liver transplant, wasn't it?
Yep, we did a podcast on that. I urge everybody to check back the links and check that out as well. But yeah, like I said, and then we touched on this subject of this fight on that podcast too, so they're worth cross-referencing for you. But basically, this was a disaster waiting to happen. The UFC did avoid a bullet here. It could have been a real black eye. At the end of the day, it was just a small incident, but they did happen in the early UFC. There was definitely that X factor. You sort of saw that come back with McGregor recently, right? And now on a corporate level, you see how fucked up things get when, police are pressing charges and, you're having to do plea bargains to avoid going to trial and stuff like that. None of that happened here. This was like, everybody at the airport the next day is like, all right, Tank's on the plane, we're safe,
Right. Yeah, get them on the plane and, look, for anyone who doesn't understand what things were like back then, if you weren't there, drinking was the elixir that made everything go, and alcohol was also the lubricant that made everything go a little too hard sometimes. So there was a time when you had to kind of hide the bottles, and there was a time when you had to bring the bottles out. And so everything was a precarious balance back in those days, and it was a rough time. Look, you would put on a show and you wouldn't know whether or not you were going to be shut down or not, for starters. Could you get it done? Would the town do an ordinance against your show? Would you have the fire marshal come in and shut you down and say, you don't meet fire codes for this? You never knew what was going to happen. We did a podcast on UFC 8 where the UFC had to fight 2 days before the show in Puerto Rico. So, things were so much different back then, and I think we take all that for granted now. And I hope we bring a lot of that to light when we do these old UFC revisits, when we do the historicity of the UFC and the historicity of MMA and what it was then still NHB. I don't think we were calling it MMA at 13 yet, were we? Or maybe just starting to?
NHB.
It was still NHB then. I don't remember. Yes. We'll have to do a podcast on when NHB turned into MMA. I think that was 98. So I think we're 1 year away yet from that, right? Because the person who did that was Blatnick. Jeff Blatnick was the one who actually came in and said, we need to change this. And he was the one who announced we're going to start calling this mixed martial arts.
Okay, I mean, that's all Meyerowitz stuff. So, how the UFC continues that history now is sort of disjointed and stuff. But yeah, this was an era where you really weren't sure. Meyerowitz, for all that Meyerowitz gets criticized at times, I feel that he put in a lot, and that I'm surprised I'm glad he got some money back when he sold. But I'm actually surprised it lasted that long, because there were so many of these little things. Because as a promoter, I'm pretty sure we were at some type of civic center or war memorial with 4,000 or 5,000 people and not a sold out crowd there. The UFC's not like that anymore. And the reason I may have gone to this show is because I couldn't get it on pay-per-view anymore. So I got in my car in 10 hours. You know what I mean? Yeah. So there were a lot of reasons for them to shut down, and they didn't. So Meyerowitz deserves a lot of credit. These types of things where this is a burden on anybody. A show like this where it ends like that, and again where at the end of the day, I guess you got Belfort, but now you got Coleman, maybe with a little bit of a question mark next to him, but definitely Abbott. You've got one of your stars, one of your premier names that maybe you shouldn't trust, and that. As a promoter, those are the types of things you're thinking about from one show to the next and stuff. So, I give Meyerowitz a lot of credit for sticking with it through these tough times. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Miguel and I have both promoted a lot of shows through the years. We know what that's about. We know what it's about to promote shows and be extremely underfunded. And I think you'll definitely agree with me in saying this, that there is absolutely no harder job on the planet than promoting. There's just nothing you can do that's that hard and that stressful. So, like you're saying, he deserves a lot of credit for what he did. And the UFC would just not be here had somebody not been there to say, we're going to persevere and the show must go on. With that.
All right. Really fast, I agree with you about promoting. It's why I've always been a matchmaker. And, not that that's easier, but I do think it's easier because if you're honest, everybody knows what's going on and they go into the cage or the ring a little bit more comfortable. The fact is as a promoter, until the show is done and in the books, it's very much a story of best laid plans of mice and men will often go astray and you don't know what, I mean, I've had a girl, they just called her over the microphone to go do a grappling match, and she comes up to me and goes, I'm going to need a tampon first. I wasn't ready for that one. I wasn't ready for that one. It was my first time promoting women's grappling, and we didn't have spare tampons, but we knew that the paramedics would have them because a lot of the times they use the tampon thing for bloody noses too.
Yeah.
So we got her one, and but I wasn't ready for that. And promoting is very much like that. Something's going to happen, whether it's, the venue, the commission, the television station, the cops, the fire engine, whatever could happen. The cornerman didn't show up. The fighter didn't show up. Forget the X factors.
Hey, I've got one. Do you remember a guy named Leo Sylvestre?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Leo Sylvestre was a guy from Indianapolis. Hit like a truck. If you put Leo on the ground, he was pretty much done. But if you got hit by Leo, you were going to hit the ground, and you were going to hit hard, and you were probably going to be asleep when you hit. Leo goes to a show in Anderson, Indiana, to fight in what was formerly a Big Lots. Okay, these are small local shows back in the day in the 90s and early 2000s, and he's going to fight this guy who was deaf, for whatever that's worth. And this guy had ran through all of his opponents. And so he was selling hundreds of tickets, which in a small venue was a lot. And so the promoter had really beefed him up. And he put him in there with Leo for kind of a title shot. It was the final fight of the night. The crowd's going completely bananas. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. Ran way over like these shows often did. And Leo's out there. He's ready to go. This kid comes out of the dressing room, walks down to the cage, turns left like he's going to go to the door, turns left again, and goes up through the hallway into the bathroom. And then the music's still playing. Leo's in, and 5 minutes later, Leo's still standing there. And then pretty soon, Leo's like, and the referee's like, and we're in the corner like, and the promoter's going, the kid climbed out of the bathroom window and left. He got scared, climbed out of the bathroom window and left. Anything can happen in MMA. Remember that. You heard it here first on the Cage Rage podcast. Hey, Miguel, anything to add before we sign off on this one? It's been fun.
Yeah, I look back at Leo Sylvestre. I remember Leo, he was the guy who would show up for the paycheck, more than anything else. But he, like you said, he had a punch. And you kind of wonder what some guys, if you had taken the dedication of a real pro and giving it to this guy, you know, what he would have done. He fought a couple of UFC champions, Rich Franklin, Dave Benet.
Yep.
He fought Butterbean in an MMA fight.
Yep.
You know, there are other interesting names in his career. You know, if you look at it, I match made him several times. He fought our guy Scott Henze. He fought Keith Raquel for me. A couple of hook and shoot appearances later with Joe Baez. Once I had left there and stuff like that. So definitely an interesting guy. And he's a guy that I'm sure has more stories than just that one. Another guy from the underground where it reminds me of another Indiana story of one time. We had a local guy from Evansville named Myron McNary. He trained with a local cop that was there. And Myron was set to fight a guy named Brady. I'm not going to remember his name for sure, but Anderson, I think his last name was maybe. And this kid had done some jail time. He'd been in jail with Mike Tyson in Indiana and stuff. But he'd never fought before. He had a judo background, had judo pants and stuff. And McNary didn't show up at the weigh-ins. So we scrambled around. There was a guy on Fulton's team, on Travis Fulton's team, that would take the fight for $25. This kid, he was making his debut, and the judo kid looked at him and said, "Yeah, that'll do. I'll be all right." You know. At any rate, the judo kid gets announced. He walks into the ring. The replacement's waiting to get into the ring, and Myron McNary shows up. He goes, "I got this." And the other kid goes, "Okay," and walks away. And Myron walks in there. I can see the judo guy looking for me when the bell rings. And when the bell rings, he charged out and he got guillotined right away. So at least he didn't get hurt.
Yeah.
But yeah, we switched opponents, and you know, I guess we were in breach of contract, and I drank my way out of that one with him. We went to the bar. We went to the bar, and I bought him drinks all night. And we talked about how I was honest with him, how it happened. I told him the truth. I'm not from Indiana. I organized the non-Indiana fighters. The Indiana fighters kind of, I got to give a little bit of leeway because the other promoter has him, and this was a miscommunication between us, man. You know, it is what happened. I didn't want to dick the guy. His brother was pissed. His brother was mad at the end of the day when we ripped up the contract together. So it was definitely an interesting day. Now we're off subject though.
Yeah, but you know what? You're never off subject when you're talking about the history of MMA, because the history of MMA is as bizarre as anything you can possibly imagine. We talk about the history of boxing on other podcasts, and boxing and MMA, although they're very much different, they're the same animal when you get right down to it, because the truth is that they're both about two men or two women stepping towards one another to solve a dilemma. That is, to decide a question. That is, who's going to leave this victorious. And
the main problem with sport as we have it is that, you know, how close to all things are fair on all sides can you get to have a fair fight? You know what I mean? And that doesn't always happen, and that's a lot of the X factor these guys deal with, you know?
Yeah.
A guy like Leo Sylvester be like, "Hey, yeah, you're going to pay me a couple $100, I'll get in there in a couple hours." And at the end of the hours, he's got his couple $100. That's what he was thinking of, a couple $100, not a win. You know, not I'm going to show them the new technique, you know.
Right.
Not this is what I've been training for, none of that.
Yeah.
And so it is a different ballgame. And you got to respect it because, you know, that's the roots of it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any issue with the guys that got out there and said, "You know what? I need to make my rent. I need to make my child support. You know, I've got an electric bill due, whatever it is." Man, I had plenty of those guys, and if that's what they wanted to do, I didn't have any problem with it. It's just the way it's how they thought, and how they trained. The extent to which they trained was up to them. It wasn't up to me. I wasn't the one getting punched in the face. My job was to deliver a fight for the crowd to show up and see, and that was my job, and that's what I had to do. I tried to give the crowd the best fight that I could possibly give them, but on 24 hours notice, You don't have that. You don't have that ability. You know, that dwindles very quickly, and you're reduced to a Rolodex of who will take that fight right now. The UFC, in their beginning, in their fledgling years, didn't have a massive Rolodex any more than anyone else did. And so they had to do what they had to do because the show must go on. And we saw that last weekend in the UFC when the Australian fight was reduced to pretty much garbage. It was pretty bad.
Exactly.
That's probably the worst.
Exactly.
That's probably the worst pay-per-view I've ever seen, frankly. So, you know, what are you going to do about it? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. The show must go on. At least they got it done.
Absolutely. You know, the UFC, they're still, last week's show, they're still susceptible to the same problems. They don't have the same recourses, you know. Everybody's got to have a medical exam. Everybody's got to have, you know, so you can't just get the local tough guy to step in and help you out.
Right.
Kind of thing. So, you know, it's a long way, but focusing back, let's just take it back to UFC 13. You had Tank coming in as an established star. You had Belfort coming in as a phenom from Brazil with an acknowledgement to the Gracies in Jiu-Jitsu. You had Couture coming in as a wrestler, which was going to prove the foil to Jiu-Jitsu, right? A second wrestler after Coleman. Kerr was next. So the American wrestlers were about ready to say, this ain't a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu game all by itself, right?
Yeah.
Royce Alger was there. Royce was one of the guys that, you know, wrestling credential-wise is ahead of the ball game on almost everybody, and he's 0-2 in the UFC, you know, so he was one of the wrestlers that didn't make it. But you're starting to see the UFC turn towards athletes and people practicing the sport, and they're making a concerted effort to bring in talent specifically for this. So by UFC 13, Couture's not there because, you know, to deal with Couture, it wasn't Couture's not there. Coleman may have been there because he wanted to do it. Couture, it took some doing because he wasn't going to do it for free. I'm not saying he asked for a boatload, but I'm saying he wanted to be, you know, it had to be worth his while for him to stop doing what he was doing. So they were already starting to see where the athletes would come from and where the sport would go.
Yeah, and Couture was one of the first guys who said, I see this as a place where I can become a millionaire. And I'm not sure that guys before him maybe saw that. I think that people watching the show believed these guys were making a lot of money, but they were not. And let's be frank, 99.9% of the guys fighting in the UFC today that you see on television, that you might see 20 times fight for the UFC, are not even making enough money to make a real living fighting for the UFC. They still have their day jobs. There are very few Randy Coutures out there. Guy Metzger was fighting. He still had a day job. Randy Couture doesn't have a day job anymore. He's Randy Couture, and he's always going to be a superstar, and he's always going to be Randy Couture from the UFC, former UFC champion. But he's kind of the first generation of those guys that came along and did that. So, having said that, this has been a fun time to look back on. We're way over on our time, though, so we got to get going. Hey, if you like what we do, tell somebody else. If you don't, tell us. Smash the subscribe button below. Share this. Tell everybody about it. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on the CageRagePodcast.com with our fancy new logo that Tony at laugh.org made. I hope I got that right, Tony. If I didn't, I'll get it right next time. They're a not-for-profit that they do excellent work with kids in the dirt. So, thank you for joining us. Until next time, we will see you again. Tune in. Namaste.